Hey guys, this is a short introductory video series on CSS. And if you're unfamiliar with HTML or if it's been a while since you've brushed up on HTML, I strongly suggest that you start with my HTML1 series before you work through this video series. CSS is a very important language to learn for web development, and it's the natural second language to learn after HTML. So what is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet, and I'll explain a little bit better what cascading means in this context in future videos. CSS is a style language. So what is a style language? A style language is a language that expresses the presentation of structured documents. So HTML, XHTML, SVG. A markup language like HTML is a kind of structured document, and CSS expresses the presentation of that kind of document. So you could think of HTML as a language that describes a body, whereas CSS is a language that describes the clothing on that body or the style of that body. There are three main ways that we can write CSS. The first way is writing CSS inline with a style attribute, and for newcomers this might be the easiest way to learn at first. So if you've seen my previous videos in HTML1, we talk a lot about HTML attributes. So we can write CSS as an HTML attribute with the style HTML attribute, and you can write your CSS here. That's the first way. The second way is rather than writing style attributes for all of your HTML elements, you can write all of your styles within the style tags inside of the head tag. So again, the head tag is good for metadata, and this is the kind of metadata that would go into the head tag. So this is slightly more abstracted than the first way and slightly more efficient. But the third way is the most common and the most abstracted way, and that is writing external CSS. So writing your CSS within its own file and then storing that usually in its own folder like this. We'll work our way up to that, but for now we're going to work with inline CSS with the style attribute. So what would be the reason for writing inline CSS? Let's say that you're developing a website, a test site of some kind that isn't actually going to make it to the web, but you want to try something out. Or let's say that there is one very tiny change that you need to make on an element that for some reason makes more sense to you to write it in line than rather writing it in its own CSS file. This is where you would write inline CSS. But as you'll see, once we start adding all these different CSS properties, the amount of contents that can go within this style attribute can be very visually cumbersome. And these HTML elements can get very long, and at that point you're going to want to either store your CSS in the head tag or more commonly store your CSS in an external file. But we're starting here. So I'm going to give this anchor tag some CSS and then let's talk about it. I'm going to give it two properties. One's called background color and the other property is called color. So this is the standard syntax for the style attribute. So you have the style keyword followed by the equal sign followed by the quotation marks. That's not any different from any other HTML attribute. But inside, this is where it gets different. So this is the CSS, and this is the syntax for the CSS. So you have a CSS property like background color or color, followed by a colon, followed by a space, followed by a value for that CSS property, followed by a semicolon to close out that statement. So this is one whole statement right here. Followed by a space and then another CSS statement. So you have the CSS property, the colon, the space, and then the value for that property, followed by the semicolon to close it out. The semicolon is very important to make this work here. And you'll see semicolons in JavaScript and other languages. So this is something that you're going to see a lot more as you develop more. Let's take a look at what this looks like. So I'm going to save that and refresh. So what did these both do? So background color is pretty self-explanatory. Background color essentially sets the background color of an element. Pretty easy. So what does color do then? Color sets the text color of the element. You'd think it would be called text color, but it's not. It's just called color. So when I save this again and go back over here and refresh, let's look again. So what did it do? So the pixels behind the text or the background has been changed. So the background color has been changed to pink, and the actual color of the text has been changed to white. So the color value changes the text color, whereas the background color changes the background. The background color is pretty self-explanatory, but color refers to text color. And just to make something clear, we can put these styles on anything. So I can go up here and change the background color on the body even. Let's change it to khaki. And let's actually remove these styles because this is going to get ugly otherwise. So I'm going to save that, refresh. Cool. So as you can see, you can put this style attribute on pretty much any HTML element. So the style, the CSS, you can see that this can be very powerful. One other thing before we continue. Color in CSS can be represented in a number of different ways. And one of those ways is using color names like this. For somebody that's new to CSS, this can be very useful because the other color types that you can use within CSS can be very confusing. We'll get to those. But for now, we're going to work with color names. In the very early versions of CSS, there were only 16 color names. Now in CSS4, there's over 140 different color names that you can use. And I've added 2 resources here that you can use to check out color names in CSS. This is one of them. This is the first one for the Crockford CSS color names. And they have all these different color names that are CSS color names that you can use, and when you click on them, it changes the color of these borders in the background. And it can be very good to see what 2 different colors or 3 different colors look like against one another. And that can be nice to kind of identify a color palette for a website you're working on. This other site, this Commuter Creative 147 CSS colors, they have 147 different CSS color names here that you can kind of cycle through randomly. And I think the design of this website is really nice, very clean, very minimal. And it's really nice to see what these CSS color names can do and what they look like. So this is just the tip of the iceberg of what you can do with CSS. And we're only working with 2 CSS properties here, but this is going to get very heavy very fast, and we're going to have a lot of different color, not just color, a lot of different CSS properties.